Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 27th of August 2023. It takes me quite a long time to do these things, obviously, what with mapping, and then, goodness me, sources are flying all over the shop, and I'm not talking about ketchup. They are just, obviously in the midst of a counter-offensive. Things are pretty funky, but there's also some bits of news that just came out after I did my news pieces. I just want to share these with you because I think they're pretty significant. Okay, the SBU attacked the airfield in Kursk with drones. Now, I did report this, that Kursk was attacked, but no real details came out. Well, apparently, a total of 16 kamikaze drones reportedly worked against 4 Su-30s and 1 MiG-29. Additionally, an S-300 complex radar and 2 Pantsir air defense systems were among the targets. Sorry, radars. It is claimed only 3 of the 16 drones were shot down, while the others managed to hit their targets. There could be some significant targets taken out in those strikes on Kursk. So that is an important bit of news. But also, we have heard previously that actually Pantsir and S-300s aren't doing the jobs they should be doing in taking out aerial threats. They are just underperforming. We've heard this a number of times recently, particularly. And then also this in Crimea, 14 soldiers were attacked in their barracks. So this is not something that we've seen, particularly on this scale. 14 soldiers were killed in one military unit not far from Evpatoria. This was reported by sources in the general staff and the government of Crimea. According to them, the soldiers were killed in their sleep. Unknown saboteurs killed some of them with blows to the heart. Some of them cut their throats. How the criminals bypassed the guards and ended up in the barracks, no one can yet understand. Wow. If that is true, this is precisely what Ukraine would want, which is obviously taking out Russian soldiers, but also think of the reaction to this, the worry, the concern, the kind of psychological element that would go alongside with that. Anyway, that is that. Well, let's go to, before we go to the northeast sector, to the Kupiansk sector, just a couple of general things to say. I reported this earlier today, but there is activity consistently taking place, apparently, has been for a very long time, between Ukraine's kind of mainland, if you like, and Crimea, in the middle of the sea, there in the Black Sea, where we have these oil rig platforms, and they're being treated very similarly to Snake Island as a platform to use to strike targets. Both sides this would refer to. So you can place missiles on there and fire at Ukraine, or you can fire at occupied territory in Crimea. You could also use this as a staging place for boats and attacks, so on and so forth. Anyway, they have been fighting over these and continue to do so. So they claim that both the Russian Federation and Ukraine periodically occupy them with their troops. Anyway, that's not something I reported on before, so I thought I would add that. And here, Kiev Independent says skirmishes between Ukraine and Russia's maritime and air forces are unfolding over strategically important gas and oil platforms in the Black Sea, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. Right, and then the last bit. So this is going to kind of go against the grain of what supposed unnamed US officials have been saying. So the commander of the ground forces of the armed forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, called for strengthening the defense of Kupiansk. So this is up here. This is here where the Russians have been edging forward, apparently, according to the Russian sources, as of yet unconfirmed by independent sort of video evidence and whatnot. But I assume that they are putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians up there. As the New York Times writes, at a time, the Pentagon, as the New York Times writes, believes that the Ukrainian command should not divert troops to strengthen the defense of the Kupiansk district, but concentrate them on a section of the front to break through Russia's defenses. So we have this situation where apparently US sources are saying, look, pull out. You've got too many people in Bakhmut. You don't need to be defending here too much. You need to be concentrating on breaking through on the front line in the south. Velikonovosilka, Robotine, Vasilivka, so on and so forth. And yet here we have Syrsky saying, no, actually, we need to concentrate some defensive forces up into north, obviously reflecting a worry that the Ukrainians are under quite a bit of pressure in that northern sector. Now, just to remind people to pause the video if you want to check out what the lines mean on my map, because we're now going to go to the map. Here it is. We'll get rid of the legend. I'm still here. and we'll get rid of him. So now, what I want to do is go to this Kupiansk sector, but we're going to go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, to talk about some of these claims concerning the Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea front line. Here, the UK Ministry of Defence stated on August the 26th, so a day or so ago, that Russian forces may launch an operational level offensive in the Kupiansk and Liman directions in the next 2 months. So this might then speak to what Syrskyi has just been saying. Though the ISW assesses such an offensive operation remains unlikely, I'd agree. The UK MOD stated that Russian forces will possibly try to regain the initiative amidst the Ukrainian counter-offensive operations by launching such an offensive operation. The UK MOD assessed that Russian forces will possibly try to advance west to the Oskil River and create a buffer zone around occupied Luhansk Oblast. Okay, as you might well know, you've got the Oskil River coming down here through Kupiansk. It comes down all the way to join the Sversky Donetsk down here around sort of Oskil and Liman sort of area. So here we've got Izium. If you remember, the Ukrainians took that back. It could be that the Russians have their eyes on the Oskil. We saw them trying to advance across the Zherebets River here in the in the Karmazianivka area. Fighting presently over a very small village called Novohayarivka, which is so small it hasn't even turned up yet on the map. Yeah, it has. There it is. So that is there. That could be part of this move towards Yoskil, or it could just be an attempt to distract the Ukrainians, of course. Right. Now, it continues. The ISW Russian forces have been conducting localized offensive operations northeast of Kupiansk and southwest of Svatova in recent weeks, but there are no indications that Russian forces are committing the necessary firepower, manpower, and material required to turn such localized offensive operations in this sector of the front into an operational offensive effort. Ukrainian ground forces commander Syrskyi stated on the 25th that Russian forces are transferring elements of newly formed brigades and divisions to the Kupiansk and Liman directions after a month of significant losses in order to resume active offensive operations in 3 directions, although the ISW has not observed confirmation of these transfers. So you put that together with what we just heard Syrskyi saying, actually, we need to defend here against the Russians. He's also just claimed that the Russians are pouring in some fresh forces to there, or newly formed brigades and divisions. Of course, they might not be very well trained. They might be coming fresh from Russia. There could be some of those crypto mobilized troops that we've seen of immigrant, legal and illegal immigrant populations there. So we shall see. The RSW has not observed confirmation of those transfers, however. The resumption of a localized Russian offensive operations is likely aims to fix and draw Ukrainian forces to the axis and away from more critical areas of the front, and has little likelihood of securing major territorial gains. Russian forces concentrated manpower for months in this sector of the front before launching their unsuccessful winter-spring 2023 operational offensive effort, and ISW has observed no similar preparations in the area. Russian forces are highly unlikely to be able to seize the operational initiative in the next 2 months. So this is to say, essentially, the ISW is saying, yeah, Syrskyi might be saying that, but we don't really see evidence that that's the case. He's saying that Kupiansk is kind of under pressure. We need to pour in some defensive forces to that area to stop the Russians taking kind of Sinkivka and coming and threatening Kupiansk from the northeast. But then there's also activity still taking place around this Raihorodka down to Novovodyanye area with that little village, Novohayarivka, sorry. Here, earlier, the ISW says the Ukrainian Eastern Forces spokesperson stated 2 days ago that Russian forces shifted their tactical focus from Kupiansk to Novohayarivka. So that's interesting. Again, these different claims coming from the Ukrainians. So Syrskyi saying, right, they're pressuring from northeast of Kupiansk, we need to bring forces to there. And then someone else saying, actually, no, they are moving forces from the Kupiansk sector to this area where they had some success and then was subsequently pushed back. No, not sort of Kuzmivka. Sorry, it's here. So if you remember, they pushed from this white line onwards, took about 5 to 7 kilometers worth of territory, depending on who you listen to, and then was subsequently pushed back in some places almost to where they started. And that is where the claim is that the Russians are they're drawing some forces to. Okay. Other than that, that's just a general discussion. There are the normal claims of repelled attacks all the way down this front line, Torska as well, the forest area, Bilahorivka, so on and so forth. Uh, I'm not going to dwell on those. We have the Kiev Independent here. It was the last thing to say about this sector. Eastern grouping Russia ramps up offensive towards Liman, Kupiansk with over 100,000 troops. This is something we had heard before. Seems to be coming up again, and this fits in line with what Sursky is saying. Russia's concentrated over 100,000 troops in the Kupiansk to Liman direction of the front, according to Yevlash, and he was one that's just said that the the Russians are now concentrating more on Novohayarivka than indeed Kupiansk. These troops have significantly intensified their rate of shelling and airstrikes against Ukrainian positions, according to Yevlash. He said there are 45,000 soldiers specifically attacking towards Kupiansk and 48,000 towards Liman. I mean, that's a pretty big number of troops. Someone says I had to look him up because it wasn't clearly stated. Yevlash is a press officer. So yeah, again, he's a press officer. This is true. Is this definitely happening? Well, this is obviously what the Ukrainian army wants people to believe. Are there 45,000 and 48,000 troops? I mean, I've said before that while they might have troops in this whole area, only a small proportion of them will be, frontline troops that you'll give a gun to and say, right, run at the Ukrainians. Most of them will be, medics, mechanics, logistics, and all sorts of people behind those front lines. Anyway, that's what's going on in that sector. We'll now go to Bakhmut, where not a lot is happening, particularly in the north. It's been rather quiet there. The ISW says, all the usual places are mentioned, but no confirmed advances really for the Russians or the Ukrainians in that northern area. Geolocated footage published on the 26th indicates that Ukrainian forces advance further into Klishchivka, however. So just to remind you, let's go back to the map. Sorry to flick around so much. So you got Bakhmut here. You got the northern area where it's been fairly calm, a bit of a stasis, although we have seen some footage coming from Zalizhnyansky. I haven't heard of any changes to that area in terms of the map. And then Deep State map has some improvements for Ukraine in Klishchivka itself. There are these different ideas of what control means. So Andrew Perpetua doesn't have the Ukrainians in control of doesn't have either side in control of Klishchivka. No. Okay, start again. Andrew Perpetua does not have the Russians controlling Klishchivka at all and has this as a grey zone. You can see the Russian defensive line is in blue here, goes along the railway track to the north of Klishchivka. Deep State map has the Russians in control of the northern half, but they've shifted them further back to the north over the last 24 hours. So the Ukrainians have been pushing them through. And Suryat maps has Russia fully in control of Klishchivka. Now, that latter claim is absolutely false. I would contest that claim. It depends how you define the Russians being in control. There are Russians in the north of Klishchivka that are still being pushed out. Whether that means they control it, I don't know. Anyway, here we have the geolocated footage that suggests there's been an advance, as according to the ISW. Fighters of the Safari Assault Regiment, the Safari Brigade, of the Lyut Brigade storm Russian positions in the central part of Klishchivka. And some of the footage, it looks a bit like this, where they're just kind of going through, shooting at and clearing buildings, small buildings and shacks in Klishchivka. That has been geolocated to this position. So this is to say that the Ukrainians appear to be in control of this area. They're clearing the Russians out, and that would suggest, in fact, that's probably the sort of footage a Deep State map has looked at and said, right, we're moving the Russian line back by this kind of street. Also, it wasn't a huge move, but I'd assume it would be based on footage like that. So that's what the ISW have stated, and Deep State are agreeing with. A couple of other claims here. So Ukraine advances further into Klishchivka, so they have the Russians in control of half of Klishchivka still. But they've put, Global War Monitor has put this area now under Ukrainian control, and DEFMON, fairly similar there, geolocated Ukrainian progress in Klishchivka with some footage there to suggest that the Russians have been pushed back, and he's referring to exactly the same footage. So he's adjusting his mapping accordingly. So that's what's going on in Bakhmut. We heard yesterday that actually, according to a commander there, they are making some of the best progress in this area here. I mean, I don't know. We've not seen any change to the mapping just north of Khodymyvka. The Ukrainian Eastern Forces spokesperson, again, Yevlash, reported 2 days ago that Ukrainian forces are advancing 100 to 300 meters every day in the Bakhmut direction. So that is obviously rather vague, and I guess you could have 100 meters to the south near Khodymyvka on one day, and then 200 meters near Klishivka on another day, and then 100 meters the next day up near Zalizhnensky or whatever. So I'm not sure whether that means that those advances are being made on this in the same place each day. Right. Okay. As we come past Avdiivka, ISW suggests that all the usual places being mentioned, but not a lot of change, and the same goes for the rest of the Eastern Front, all the way down to Vuhledar here. There is the Ukrainians claim that there's a repelled Russian attack near Vuhledar yesterday. Velika Novosilka appears to be in the middle of an operational pause as the Ukrainian forces are refitting around there. So not really any information coming out of there either. So it's really all about Robotna, and there's just a lot coming out of the Robotna area. So we go to the ISW. Well, actually, that's probably not the best place to start. Let's go and look at what Poulet Volant has suggested here, and I think this is probably out of date now. So this is a lot of pressure being put northwest of Verbove here. If we go to my map, just give you an idea of what we're talking about. So we're coming all the way past Drozhyanka and to Robotna, Novoprokopivka here. So the places are going to be important are Kopani, where there seems to be activity, Novoprokopivka, and between there and Robotna, and then east of there on this kind of hill area here. So if we look at the I don't know if you can see here, there's a number that changes when I move my cursor, and this gives you a height. So here you've got about 160 meters there. It's pretty much the highest, and it kind of goes downhill on the way to Verbove, and downhill on the way to Novopokropivka. And it appears that this height, Hill 166, I think it's called, is where they're kind of fighting at the moment. So that's one of the major places. Verbove, and then up to Novopokrovka there. So those are the main places that we'll be mentioning. Rebar, although they haven't given an update for sort of 2 days on their international channel on Telegram, they've posted on Twitter yesterday. It's still quite a long time ago, but it's 16 hours ago, so it's not particularly recent. But there's a few things worth noting. So we go through the in Robotna, assault units of the Ukrainian 47th returned to the front line, trying to fully capture the village. Fighting is still going on the southern outskirts. So this is another Russian claim that they're still fighting in Robotna. I just don't think that's true. But you do see this from a number of places that they're fighting on the southern outskirts there. Yeah. I mean, it could be true, but I doubt it. The enemy's original plan to establish control of Robotna by Ukrainian Independence Day was thwarted. At the same time, it was reported that losses have reached quite significant numbers as a result of these meat assaults. Is that projection? Is that, are the Ukrainians losing a lot of troops in doing this? They probably are losing a fairly significant number of troops, to be quite honest. The most intense battles took place near Verbove, where detachments of the AFU 82nd Air Assault Brigade and 46th Air Mobile Brigade tried to crush the numerical superiority. They use a standard tactic: first artillery destroys fortifications, and then infantry break through. Thus, the enemy was able to advance in the tree belts west of Verbove, regardless of losses. Rescue teams of the 15th Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine were sent in to remove dead and wounded. Judging by the nature of the attack, so this is selling its all as really costly for the Ukrainians. Whether that is true or not, of course, take this with a pinch of salt. This is your most pro-Russian source here. Judging by the nature of the attacks, the AFU intend to wedge between the villages and force the Russian troops to retreat from the settlements, thereby straightening the front line, and after that to move inland to the heights of 136.8 and 110.3 west of Verbove. To support the offensive, 12 D-30 howitzers from the 118th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainians were moved to Malatok Machka, and 5 AS-90 self-propelled howitzers, they're the ones given by the UK, of the 117th were moved to Omelnik and Krasnokrinitsa. So that's significant if it's true that the Ukrainians are bringing in more artillery to support their attack there. Kenneth Gregg, the Finnish fighter, as I reported earlier, and I think this is worth, some of this I've already told you. So if you watch my news video, you will know this already. On the front lines, we are making progress at Robotine and Klishivka. In Robotine, Deep State map now shows parts of the Russian defense line are under our control. So if we go back to my map, when you look at Robotny, here now, along this entire line there, this is the main, and it sort of curls off down there. This is the main line of defense, the main trench line for the Russians here. This is almost like their second trench line. They did have a non-contiguous trench line up here that the Ukrainians overcame and control parts of that here, and now they can roll down that trench line as it comes to the one that joins here. So there's a bit of a conjunction of trench lines around here, and they can fight towards Verbove. And if they can break through anywhere around here, then they can get into this trench line and fight up and fight down it, rolling up and down the trench lines. I'll just show you that in a second. This is Andrew Perpetua's map here, and you can see the massive trench lines around this Robotin area where they are fighting. And you could argue that this is one of the worst places to have attacked, but they obviously have their reasons. Tokmak is surrounded by trenches. You have a number just north of Polohi, and you have a number around Ocheretuvate. And what I was talking about the confluence of trenches just here in this northern area where the Ukrainians have control of some of these trenches and can move down the trenches to there, and they appear to be, and some are claiming they've made a breakthrough today, and if they've made a breakthrough in this hill area there, then they can fight up the trenches or down the trenches rather than fighting into the trenches all along there, and that will be far more difficult. Okay, so that's the situation there. So just to go back to Kenneth Gregg, I might shut some of these down. I've got too much open. He says, this means that we continue to roll up their trenches. The Russians have now started withdrawing units from the contact line to behind the defense fortifications. They have also left Novopokrovka mostly on foot. Our artillery fired on their few cars with good results. So this then goes against some of the claims that the Russians are making that they are still fighting Robotna. You've got Kenneth Gregg saying, well, actually, they're fleeing Novopokrovka. There was talk yesterday about how it might have been taken, or maybe that was even the day before, and I was saying that that's almost certainly too optimistic. However, it does appear that the Ukrainians have continued their momentum through Novopokrovka. Kenneth Gregg says they since they've put their own troops in the gap between defence lines 2 and 3, so that is, let's assume this is defense line 1, which has pretty much been broken. I don't know why it was not continuous from there to there, but that's been broken, and this is kind of 2, I presume 3, and then a 4th one down here. So between 2 and 3, there will not be huge dense minefields because they need to move supplies between lines 2 and 3 while they hold 2. Otherwise, they're just going to be blowing themselves up on mines. That means that if the Ukrainians break through the second line of defense, then it'll be much quicker for them to go from line 2 to line 3 than it was for them to do all of this, because this is all really heavily mined. It took them most of the time to get from up here, Malatok Machka, to this front line here. That was the most difficult, and that wasn't because of these trenches. There were no big trenches, there were just trenches in every tree line, but there were also hugely densely mined fields. Right, okay. There's no problem with the minefields from between lines 2 and 3. After we've taken our positions on the flanks, the offense will be faster. In addition, we do not currently have a critical shortage of ammunition. Verbove and Novopokrovka will be completely under our control within a few days. There will be a regrouping, and the spearheads will go full throttle. Also, the Uruzhany front will see action in the coming days, so that's once they've refit. At Klishivka, the Russians are almost completely driven out of the town. At Kupiansk, there is no danger, although some media report otherwise. We discussed that a little bit so far. Right, moving on, we have Ukrainian fighters are advancing in the village of Novopokrovka next to Robotny in the Melitopol region. That's according to the Ukrainian armed forces themselves. The losses of the Russians there are high, and they are forced to urgently transfer troops from other areas of the front. So we'll come to speak about that in a little while. Ukrainians have cleared and penetrated some of the heavily mined areas along Russia's main line of defense in this area, particularly around Verbove. And the key to this are reports from Ukrainian sources that they've taken control of one or more key ground lines of communication, so some roads in the area that allow them, to move things around or interdict Russian logistics. So it seems to be a lot taking place around this Verbove area, and we'll see a few of these sources mentioning that Ukrainians advance and consolidate in the direction of Verbove. So it's both north of Verbove here. So if I make that a little bit bigger, you've got Verbove there, you've got Robotna there, and Novopokrovka there. So both kind of to the west, slightly west southwest of Verbove. You have some advances, and then north near Novopokrovka, which is a smaller town. That might be Novopokrovka there. So between these two settlements. And the Ukrainians have taken control of a number of strongholds. The number of Russian counterattacks has increased significantly, and that's what always happens when the Ukrainians have some success. The Russians will counterattack straight away. And I've argued that although that means it's really difficult for the Ukrainians to advance quickly, it does also trick Russian troops quite a lot. So the harder they fight, the worse it looks for the Ukrainians, until at some point the Russians have nothing left because they fought so hard. Rather than just retreat to more easily defensible positions, they go on the counterattack, and they continually do this. And I'm not sure how wise that is. Fighting continues in the southern outskirts of Robotine, whether that means the town itself or more down here between Robotna and Novopokrovka. Right, so then we start getting slightly more recent. Since yesterday, there have been field reports from the Ukrainians have conquered a key height between Novopokrovka and Verbove. That's that red circle on the map, kind of where I was talking to you about. You can see he's got the trench line there, so that is the trench line is right on that hill. So that's going to be here, in that area there. Right, so he says there is no visual evidence of that at the moment, but the height is on the main Russian defensive line. Reportedly, this may jeopardize Russian defense in this area since Novopokrovka and Verbove stand downhill. Russians seem to have weakened their defense in Kopane to strengthen Novopokrovka and Verbove with the apparition of new units, and we're going to talk about that as they try to counterattack on the eastern flank. Also, some reports that Ukrainian positions are just a field away from Novopokrovka. That is to say that they are very close to Novopokrovka. Don't know what direction that is in, and also this claim that the Russians are pulling troops away from places like Kopane to fill in around here. Now, what that tells me is if you're pulling troops from Kopane, you're weakening Kopane, which is a real problem. But it means you're not pulling them from elsewhere, like, I don't know, Tokmak, Pokrovska, whatever. You're not pulling troops from deep in your own territory. You're pulling them from other areas of the front line, which means that you don't have a strength in depth there. That is a real worry if that is indeed true. Right, moving on, just this area by Verbove now coming out along this road here. So that is just here. The Ukrainians have had some success, according to Global War Monitor, 2.2 kilometers away now from the town, and then goes on to later say an area just to the north of that now, Ukraine is expanding the Robotna axis in order to prepare for more attacks towards Verbove. So again, more success according to Global War Monitor. Trentelenko. Now we're going to get on to the discussion that I had earlier with you today, if you watch my news piece, which was Tatarigami saying that they have the Russians do have, and I said this yesterday, according to him, they do have their very best reserves to pull on. And this is the VDV, the Airborne Division, 76 Guards Air Assault Division, that were at some point in Crimea. There are various claims, some saying that actually they were pulled out from Crimea 2 months ago. What they've been doing since then. So there are some indications that it might not be pulled straight from the front line to come here, that they have been in reserve waiting for this moment, or they have been pulled from the front line, which is interesting, but that may not be the case. But if they are now putting in their very best people to defend here, what does that say? Is this their last chance saloon, or is this just, hey, that's what we would have done anyway, and actually they have other people they can bring in afterwards if it doesn't go too well for the 76th? I don't know. Tatarigami said, I discussed Russian reinforcements yesterday and reserves in the south, but didn't mention them specifically. They are the 76th Guards Air Assault Division. I anticipated it would take a few days for the OSINT community to catch up with that, and I've now announced it. According to Russian military doctrine, at least on paper, the 76th Division is a part of their strategic reserves, underscoring the seriousness of the move. These are strategic reserves being utilized now, and that means that the Russians could well be panicking and they might not have anyone else to draw from after this. As of now, refraining from additional statements, it's crucial to acknowledge the twofold implications. On the one hand, this does strengthen the Russian operational capacities. Of course it does. These are their best troops. On the other, their failure, so if they fail, it will critically impair the combat readiness of their reserves for rapid deployment. Lastly, I want to highlight the division is comprised of various units. Therefore, it's more accurate to refer to elements and units of the 76th Division. This is distinct from the complete division with all its constituent units. In other words, this might well be a somewhat degraded unit anyway. And if you're throwing them in, it's not like you're throwing the whole 76th Division, but actually just bits and pieces that are left. We know that some of their best units, like the Naval Infantry brigades that were fighting in Vuhledar, were reconstituted like 3 times. The 155th and the 40th were absolutely hammered here, and they've been reconstituted somewhere between 3 and 9 times, and that's going back a couple of months. But reconstituted not with elite troops. Normally, you take these, like the VDV and the Marines, you would say take your best troops, right? And you say, we're going to take the cream of the crop from existing trained troops and then train them to an even higher degree for these elite groups. But of course, in the middle of this war, when they don't have that ability to do that, then they just take mobilized troops into their elite units, and it means they aren't taking the cream of the crop, they're just taking anyone. So when you reconstitute units like this, actually you are degrading. The force quality goes down and down. And when if you are worried that the 76th are being used here, I would say that they're not going to be at their optimal by any stretch of your imagination. In fact, they'll be the weakest they've ever been, probably ever. And then also, what does that say going forward? So Defmon says 76th is considered the best unit the Russians have. They should be fairly fresh. They were replaced by other units on the Crimea sector 2 months ago. And then Tatragami says, in answer to the question, is Russia terrified of a possible breakthrough? Aware of the fact that the subsequent fortifications are poorly defended. And Tatragami says, that's how I read it. Otherwise, I don't see a reason for such a rapid troops redeployment. So in other words, the Russians are panicking and they are worried about a breakthrough, and they don't trust their own fortifications, as in they are poorly defended. So we're going to send in our very best now. But some of these have already, been eliminated by the looks of it. So souvenirs from Robotine, transferred elements of the VDV 76th Guards Air Assault Division. So when soldiers die, they often have their patches taken off them by the enemy so that they know who they were fighting, and just for little souvenirs. This unit was located on the axis of Crimea and is considered the best division of the VDV, part of their strategic reserve. So, right, this morning I dipped into this source, which was really, really good. I'm going to give it a very quick précis. I'll put the link to this below. It's not from Tatragami. He's just putting it all, synthesizing it all in one place. It's from Alexander Solonko, who's fighting in the south there. And he says what it's like, what's going on. He says that the terrain is flat and that makes it quite difficult. You can be seen, you can't really hide anywhere. You've got tree lines, but what he says about the fortifications is pretty interesting. I read through that with you previously. Great deal of talk about these. That every tree line has been dug up. We're not just talking about trenches. There's an entire system of trenches, dugouts, and even underground tunnels in some places. In each tree line, there's a network of trenches and firing positions for various weapons. Anti-tank ditches and mine obstacles stretch across the fields, from regular mines to more sophisticated ones, all lying in wait for the infantry. Once again, it's crucial to emphasize that we're specifically discussing a system of trenches interconnected by passageways and pathways. These pathways facilitate the movement of personnel, weaponry, and ammunition. As for what remains unexcavated, it's mined. All of this must be navigated to make progress forward. For those who are overly smart, scare quotes, and believe that the Ukrainian armed forces took an incredibly long time to drive the Russians out of the village of Robotine, they must have missed the defense system that needed to be overcome in order to push the Russians away from the Mariupol highway and gradually approach the village, encircle it, and finally seize control. Truly, a monumental task has been accomplished. So he's just saying that this is really difficult terrain to take. It's flat, you can be seen from a long way away, and there are mines everywhere, and there are sophisticated mines and standard mines, and there are trenches, and every tree line is dug into, and they are all interconnected. The Russians are establishing firing points, and they mine the routes to them. They themselves move along designed, designated paths. Our positions on the liberated territory are surrounded by mines and tripwires. Paths are cleared for ingress, and sappers gradually clear the area. And then he says sometimes these tripwires are and booby traps and mines are triggered when we use artillery, and it burns the trees and the undergrowth, and that then sets off the tripwires, or we have to call in our sappers. I mean, all of it takes resources and time. It then talks about a lot of armored vehicle losses, particularly at the beginning, and then saying that actually that is kind of justified using and losing these in attacking, but then we're using high quality Western equipment that actually saves lives. I spoke to someone who was who survived 2 direct hits on 2 different Bradleys. And they're still fighting. So that is, and he says you can take out the equipment from these Bradleys and repair it. It's like these protect lives and the stuff inside as well, really pretty effectively, even if they themselves fall by the wayside. So yeah, enemy ATGM operators position cameras in advance of their positions. This way they can spot targets in advance and engage them effectively if successful artillery finishes off the targets. Alternatively, they may start with the Air Force. And he talks about how the guided bombs, the KABs or FABs that they use, a bit like the JDAMs that the Ukrainians use, are one of the biggest fears. They use them extensively, the Russians. I can't speak to their accuracy, but the weapon is powerful. They attempt to target logistics and command centers just as we do. They don't hesitate to supply fire on roads, simply fire on roads. Forward defenses in settlements are constantly under shelling. You know, they use Lancets together with Orlan, Zala, and Supercam drones, and they attempt to break through and hunt down vehicles with the use of all these bits of equipment. So yeah, they often, when the Ukrainians recapture positions, they're like mined, and it's really difficult. Or they just the Russians end up leveling entire trench lines so they can't be usable for the Ukrainians, so on and so forth. And then at the end here, I understand why the Russians are intensively butthurt due to the loss of the village in 6th Street. So that's Robotna. They put in significant effort to prevent the Ukrainians from advancing. Defending is easier according to all norms. On the other hand, we're putting in a tremendous effort to break through. And when we succeed, it shows that our efforts are paying off. And some of the latest information is that Russian Telegram sources are talking about Ukrainian assaults at both Kopani, that I was talking about, where they pulled some troops out of there, the Russians, to try and help defend in Verbove, where the Ukrainians might well be attacking there, and towards Verbove. Another channel has asked for information about 80 Ukrainian vehicles accumulating for an attack. It's all rumors at the moment. And then he goes through some of those sources, sort of worrying about stuff. This is from War-Gone Zone, the Zaporizhzhia direction, the armed forces of Ukraine with the support of artillery attack Kopani. No promotion. Fierce oncoming battles in the village of Robotna. Ukrainian troops there after the shelling managed to move a little towards Verbova. Thus, the armed forces of Ukraine seek to expand the bridgehead in the zone of active offensive. The Russian armed forces carried out strikes against Ukrainian troops in all these places. So Defmon is saying that doesn't look like panic. So he says, if one channel reported a breakthrough around Verbove, I really don't see any panic in Russian telegrams. So there are different claims, fog of war and all that. We've got some geolocation here. This is from the ISW, or talked about in the ISW. So geolocation of FPV hitting Ukrainian infantry, which means the Ukrainians are definitely at least here. Now that is, I guess, significant if you're looking at, right, Surat Maps hasn't mapped for 2 days pretty much, so that red line will be inaccurate. But that's saying you've got Ukrainians in the grey zone here, which you would imagine, and they are certainly in a position to have pushed the Russians back to this trench line here that we know about. So that was that. And then one of the latest ones, I'm just going to look again to see what the latest is. But here, War Mapper, Mill Blogger, Majakovsk 73 says Zaporizhzhia front, Ukrainians advance towards a Verbova area, battles on a hill before Novopokrovka. Russians have sent reinforcements and are trying to hold the line. And as you can see, that line is along their own trench line there. Yeah, so I can't see any other information on the front line yet, but rest assured it's all happening around Robotine, and that's where most of the activity and the information will be coming from today. Most of the activity will be. Right. Just the last thing I wanted to say before I finish the video, activity around Kherson. The ISW talks about how Russian mill bloggers are claiming that fighting is ongoing on the islands in the delta, and that small Ukrainian landing groups have landed on unspecified islands. Russian mill blogger, another one, claimed that Ukrainian forces conducted a failed landing on Zaporizhzhia Island, which is to the southwest of Kherson. So it's going to be one of these islands around here. That's Veliki Potemkin Island. I don't know what that island they're mentioning there is, but it's going to be one of these ones around here. Okay, so just finally here, I talked to you about the 205th Separatist Motorized Rifle Brigade's recent failed attempt yesterday to attack in the area of Kozachilihiri, an island nearby, an amphibious assault there to eliminate Ukrainian units. Two companies of Russian units of the Russian 205th were ordered to conduct an amphibious crossing there. Each company was comprised of 22 soldiers and one commander. They were instructed to conduct the crossing simultaneously in two groups. However, they only had enough inflatable boats to move 15 soldiers from each company on the first crossing. The crossing was conducted without covering fire, and they immediately started taking casualties from Ukrainian mortar and small arms fire. Because of this, it was not until the next day that the remaining soldiers were able to cross and join up with their units. They did not have radios, were not able to communicate in the situation in real time. However, they were able to temporarily locate a cell signal and periodically transmit situation reports, sit reps, and the coordinates of the AFU mortar and fire teams to their command. Description of the events by the soldier. At one point, our artillery fired a couple of shots at them, but to no avail. And in general, it seemed like they did it only so they could later say they threw shells in the approximate direction and according to the exact coordinates that we sent them. The bird drone hovered over the groups from the very beginning, and the carousel began rotating drones all day. Due to the constant work of the drones, there was not a minute that they would leave the sky. Under its exact adjustments, the enemy's mortar crews continued to work in a group. Then the network was lost, the cell network. At least sometimes a cell connection appeared to convey the situation. During the first day, half of the group was already wounded. The group commander reported this to everyone he could up the chain. The battalion commander insisted on moving the group by 200 to 300 meters, but it would be pure suicide since they had been able to dig single trenches with their bare hands where they hid from mortar fire. The transition from this area to any other to an unprepared position was fraught with the complete destruction of the group due to the lack of engineering structures, and the drones constantly controlled them, even the smallest movement. Thus, the commander of the group made his decision to withdraw the remaining group from the island, thereby saving the lives of the rest of the team. Half the group was wounded. The group commander himself organized the withdrawal. The wounded of the neighboring unit was also taken away. After that, all the commands, starting from the design bureau and above, were very negative about such an act. They blamed everyone from the commander to our non-standard Blashnik, possibly brigade support, and worked that day and were the only ones who provided at least some help to the group. Now everything is developing in such a way that the KR has been moved from office. Blashnikov is being frightened by a transfer on different fronts and an article for sabotage of the landing group, although this is ridiculous, completely absurd. At the moment, our battalion has been taken to Henichesk for, quote, restoration. And complains about medical care and whatnot. And afterwards, So, according to 205th Brigade's Telegram channel, a full assistant of the Deputy Minister of Defence flew in this morning. So they had someone really high up fly in about this incident. The brigade command is protecting itself, covering its ass, and they are standing by their decision to remove the assault team's commander from his post. And it claims that he was sent to a mental hospital. In addition, phones are being seized from the fighters as they are also looking for who leaked the story. And they made a copy of the voicemail of one of the servicemen who tried to leave a message of help and have cut it up, edited it, and are now trying to charge him with sabotage. The commander of the recon platoon is moving ahead with a criminal case against the fighters who are being blamed for undermining the operation. The investigation is complete nonsense. The truth is, we were ambushed. We could not destroy them and move further along the route. And the real reason the occurrence of the situation and stated circumstances are completely ignored. I mean, wow. Note, it's believed that soldiers from the company that did not evacuate were either killed or captured. So this is absolutely terrible. And then after that, so Dimitri from War Translated is saying, you can't make this up. You may remember the complaints we shared about the 205th, which is apparently having struggles in the Dnipro Islands. Anyway, rather than helping their boys, official propagandists decided that deception was the only way to go, and filmed a staged video with members of the brigade dispelling the rumors. But this was quickly exposed by other Russians. So they really are trying, and you can read about this from War Translated, they really are trying to cover this up. It just was not a good look, and it got leaked, and yeah, things are terrible. So yeah, it's really, really bad news there. Anyway, that's the Frontline update for today. Please like, subscribe, and share. Sorry, it's a bit of a longer one. I did do a bit of analysis of what's going on in Robotine, since there's a lot of claims coming out from there, so on and so forth. Anyway, it is what it is. Take care. Thanks so much for your support. Toodle pips. Speak soon.